Those of you who've been on our first Fridays know that we always record our webinars, and this is no different. So we are really just want you all to know that this is a recording and that the recording will be shared. And if you have questions or need information, you can use the chat. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt Hirsch, our Director of Policy and Advocacy. Thanks everybody for being with us.
Thank you, Stacy. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to our friends at Community Progress for helping to facilitate this important discussion. And we were noting actually that the last time we had this webinar and we were really ready to get things kicked off was exactly 4 years ago, September 12th, 2019, a mere 2 months after this picture that you're looking at, when Phil Murphy and friends, legislative allies and advocates signed this historic land banking bill into law in Newark. There are a lot of legislative allies in this picture, and we will talk about some of them just very briefly before we get kicked in, just to give a little more context. This law was signed in, the land banking law was signed into, the bill was signed into law on July 12th, 2019. And this was the third iteration of New Jersey's attempt to craft a bill that would be signed into law to permit and promote land banking in New Jersey. Assemblywoman Mila Jacey, who is to the governor's right next to the sunbeam in the green coat, is there, and now Senate Majority Leader Teresa Ruiz, who is directly behind the governor, were the prime sponsors of the bills in the Assembly and the Senate. Prior to redistricting in 2011, Mila Jacey represented part of the West Ward of Newark, where she and housing advocates, including from the network-led Newark Community Development Network, recognized and understood the value and importance of creating a land bank entity and to allow municipalities in New Jersey to effectively manage and repurpose underused and abandoned and foreclosed properties. Our members reached out to Assemblywoman Jacey, many of you on the call, and asked her to advocate for the bill in the legislature, and we are so fortunate that she did. At the time, Assemblywoman Jacey said that the lack of housing that people can afford in our state is, quote, alarming, as are the food deserts and that plague our cities, large and small. The impetus here was that land banking lets communities control their own destiny, deciding for themselves what is best for them. The possibilities are endless, and it adds another valuable tool into the toolkit for municipalities to acquire abandoned properties. But the obstacles were daunting. The bill was first passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in 2012. It never reached the governor's desk. And when it finally did reach his desk during the next session, again with bipartisan support, it was vetoed for the first time. At the time, Jacey told the network that the governor had made it clear that he did not trust urban communities to self-govern. This is Governor Christie, by the way, prior to our current governor, Governor Murphy. But working with the network and its members, however, Assemblywoman Jacey and Senate Majority Leader Ruiz introduced a new bill 2 years later, adding language to increase the transparency by requiring that communities maintain an online database for land bank properties. Despite this addition, in the face of a desperate need for this redevelopment tool, the bill was again absolutely vetoed in 2016 by Governor Christie. When Governor Murphy was elected, the network and its legislative allies once again enthusiastically recommitted to land banking and urged the governor prior to his election in 2018 to finally get this landmark legislation over the finish line. In partnership with Newark Mayor Raz Baraka, who is also in the picture that you're looking at on the right next to Mildred Crump, who has her hands raised in victory, had the vision to recognize that such a law could, what such a law could mean for Newark and many New Jersey communities, and we were on our way. 3 committees, countless meetings, and a multitude of amendments later, the network finally stood in front of an abandoned network, Newark strip mall, with Governor Murphy and a host of city officials, legislators, and advocates to watch the land banking bill signed into law. So we persevered, but now it's about implementation, and this is where Community Progress and you come in. We really want to get things moving. We have a successful land banking operation set up in Newark, and it's time to get other municipalities on board in order to most effectively implement this really powerful and groundbreaking tool. And that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matt. And thanks, Stacy, for the introduction. My name is Liz Kozub. I serve as the Associate Director of our National Technical Assistance Team. at the Center for Community Progress, and it has been such a wonderful partnership working with the network and meeting many of you that are on the call today through some of the one-on-one interviews and kind of listen and learn activities that we've been engaging in over the summer months. And so just appreciate your time and spending it with us. I'm also joined by my colleague, Tarek Abdelazim, who is the director of our National Technical Assistance Team at Community Progress. And so for those of you who don't know us that are on the call, the Center for Community Progress is a national nonprofit. We've been working with communities since 2008, over 300 communities across the country, really think through strategies to address vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties and to repurpose those properties in line with community goals. We've done this work, especially the work with land banking, and supported nearly all of the states that have state enabling legislation for land banking, and also have worked with the majority of land banks across the country in different capacities. And so we're excited about the opportunity to hopefully work with you all in the future. And so we focus, we're most known for our work on land banking, but our work really does focus on the systems, all of the systems that address vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties. And so those systems can include code enforcement, they can include property tax enforcement, they can include vacant land stewardship and data and management. So some of those themes will be coming across in terms of the conversations that Tarek and I have with you all. Let's see. So Matt provided a really excellent overview of the incredible amount of work that the network has done to advocate for state enabling land banking legislation and the incredible amount of advocacy that has happened on this call today. So since the state passed that enabling legislation back in 2019, only one land bank has formed, and that was the Newark Land Bank that's being administered by Invest Newark. And unfortunately, when that land bank legislation was passed, a few short months after, the pandemic hit. And so understandably, many local governments and community partners, and you all part of this conversation, had to turn attention to meet the urgent needs of communities in response to that pandemic. But we've heard in recent months that there is new energy to talk about land banking now, that not that the medical part of the pandemic is behind us, but certainly a lot of the economic and crisis responses to the pandemic is. And so we've heard more and more communities interested in whether or not a land bank could be a useful tool, especially as housing challenges continue to dominate public discourse. So our work with the network is really about restarting those conversations, helping communities across the state of New Jersey better understand whether or not a land bank could be a useful tool to address some of those urgent housing needs. And so the goals for this work, it's a 2-year partnership that we've embarked on and support across the state, and hope that it continues beyond those 2 years. But our primary goals are really to expand the knowledge and understanding of what land banks are and how they can be used in communities and what circumstances they may be a useful tool. It's also to work closely with the network to build out that knowledge across the state and to understand the local challenges on the ground. So what are communities facing in terms of challenges with vacant and abandoned properties? How is the tax lien sale process affecting partners in terms of getting inventory for those properties, and how a land bank can kind of interact and be a helpful tool to communities to address some of those challenges. So we've had conversations with nearly 25 folks that are on this call today that have really helped to inform the content that we'll be sharing as part of this discussion, and then the content that we'll be sharing as part of our October 3rd webinar that we'll also talk a little bit about. Eventually, as part of this work, we really want to help communities that are interested in exploring whether or not a land bank can be helpful to have deeper conversations with local partners, with municipal leaders, elected officials, community representatives, and stakeholders that are involved in this work. And so as part of this engagement, And on the October 3rd webinar, we'll be officially releasing a scholarship application for technical assistance for our team in the network to really provide some dedicated support to up to 2 communities that are interested in exploring a land bank. But our team is here to serve as a resource to communities across the state, even if it's not that really deep dive of technical assistance. So if you all need clarifying questions on what a land bank is, how it can be helpful, we really want to make sure that we're a resource in those efforts and in those questions. And ultimately, we'd love to cultivate and support a professional statewide network of land banks across the state of New Jersey, as we've done in many other states, including New York and Georgia and Michigan, so that there can be a network of peers and you all can draw on each other, your challenges, the successes that you've had in advocacy for other state legislation. So for today's conversation, I'll be providing an overview of what land banks are, how they operate nationally, the impacts that they've had within communities. I'm going to turn it over then to my colleague Tarek to talk a little bit about the New Jersey Land Bank Law, what key provisions are in that law that communities that are interested in exploring a land bank should be aware of, kind of what barriers may exist that will need to be discussed as part of exploring whether or not land bank formation is the right tool for your community. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's next. We'll say that we've formatted this to be an hour-long presentation, and we'll do question and answers as part of this time. But then our team will stick around for at least a half an hour after the presentation that has concluded so that we can have a discussion with folks that are interested in talking more if there's additional questions or you all wanted to discuss as a network of peers some challenges or ideas or solutions that you all encountered in your work. All righty. So first off, what is a land bank? We've talked about it a lot up until this point, but land banks are public entities or nonprofits that really are hyper-focused on addressing vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties and repurposing them in support of community goals. And while land banking is fairly new to the state of New Jersey, it's not a new concept or not a new tool across the country. So there's over 300 land banks that are operating nationwide. The vast majority of them were established after 2008 in response to the housing crisis and economic crisis that happened at that time and the influx of vacant properties that local governments and partners needed to address. And the vast amount of land banks are also operating under state enabling legislation, 84% or so. And the image on your screen has the 17 states that have passed state enabling legislation. The island of Puerto Rico also has enabling legislation for land banking. So I will say that land banks operate outside of these states, and some have really robust programming, but the powers of a land bank are really limited if there's not that state enabling legislation in place. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. And importantly, approximately 90% of properties that land banks acquire are through the tax foreclosure process. We're also going to talk about that process and the implications of how it works within New Jersey. So the image on your screen provides an overview of how land banks typically get properties within their inventory. And it should be noted that the tax foreclosure system varies widely by state. And so it dictates how land banks can get properties through this process, but this provides a good overview of how it can typically happen. So typically there's some problem property that's in private ownership. And again, land banks are really hyper-focused on the vacant, abandoned properties that are causing harm to community. Typically with those properties, the owner could be not paying their taxes. It could be a number of years delinquent. It could have some significant health and safety issues at the property, and local government has been forced to do some type of abatement, either grass cutting or demolition or some other type of abatement, and the local government can put a lien on the property for those costs. And eventually there's some type of enforcement event that can happen, typically through a tax foreclosure system, where either the property tax lien goes up for sales, or ideally the property goes up for sale, and it can transition to a new responsible owner. And for properties that don't sell within that system, there can be an opportunity to foreclose and to transfer that property to a land bank. And the land bank then has the power to clear the title, to make repairs, to make sure that the property is viable and of interest to the private market. And those are really the unique powers of a land bank. And their purpose is to hold the properties as a temporary steward. Land banks typically don't want to hold the properties in the long term. They want to partner with community organizations and other folks that would be ultimately the purchasers of those properties to repurpose them in line with community goals and priorities. And so the powers of a land bank are really reliant on that state enabling legislation. And the land bank is only as powerful as the legislation allows it to be. In New Jersey, the land banking legislation outlines land bank powers, but it also puts a lot of discretion of what those powers are in the land bank agreement between the municipality and the entity that it appoints to serve as the land bank. And we'll talk a little bit about that agreement and how it functions later on, but that's just another kind of caveat for the New Jersey perspective of land banks that I wanted to add at this national conversation level. So ideally, land banks are able to acquire tax foreclosed properties in a way that's cost effective. They're able to extinguish the liens and clear the title and make sure that that property is set up in a way that folks would want to purchase it and would have limited risk in doing so. Most land banks can hold property tax exempt, which is really important because land banking operations can be pretty expensive. And so it gives an opportunity for the land bank to dedicate its funding to do its mission aligned work. And also it does reduce the cost for pre-development that may occur. Importantly, the land bank legislation should allow some type of mechanism to generate and collect revenue to support its operations. So we'll talk a bit about how the New Jersey Land Bank doesn't have a dedicated funding source. In fact, most land banks across the country do not. So it is one challenge to consider, but there is other funding opportunities that are described within the Act. One of the key powers of the land bank, and really its purpose, is to be able to dispose of properties in a way that is flexible and that is driven by the community and not driven by the highest price. And this can be different from municipalities who may be required to put a property up for RSP or to sell it to the highest bidder. And so land banks are really that steward to ensure that those properties go to an end use that most aligns with community needs. And lastly, land banks should be accountable to the public, given it's typically a governmental entity. So Community Progress regularly surveys land banks across the country to understand what the national trends are and the current state of the field. These are a few of the highlights from last year's survey. As I mentioned, almost 90% of land banks get their inventory from the tax foreclosure process. And also nearly 90% of their inventory is vacant land with no structures. Now, this doesn't mean that land banks are not doing interventions on properties that have existing structures. Many do rehabs or they partner with developers to do those rehabs, but it's notable that the vast majority of land bank inventory is vacant land with no structures. It's also notable that the most common sources of funding are from governmental sources, nearly 50%. So I mentioned only one state has dedicated reoccurring funding, and that's the state of Ohio. Some land banks get up to $7 million annually through the mechanism that they have in place through that state enabling legislation. But all the other land banks and all the 16 other states and those that are operating without that state enabling legislation have to be creative about where they're getting their funding sources. And so most of the funding sources are coming from direct appropriations from municipalities. They could be coming from state grants or federal grants that have been put in place that could support land banking operations. And the second highest funding source comes from the revenue of property sales, which is about a quarter of land bank's budget. And I bring this up to share that we hear a lot from land banks, especially those that are just starting out, that they want to be self-sustaining. And we're here to say that's largely a myth. While the revenue from property sales is certainly an impactful line item in terms of land banks' budgets, it's not enough to really support the full operations of a land bank from those that we have seen across the country. Many land banks operate and have really innovative programming. So the types of programmings and the types of activities that land banks do varies widely across the country. Some, especially rural land banks, may be targeting a handful of really problematic properties annually, and they're targeting their resources and their activities towards those. Meanwhile, other land banks, especially those that might have more dedicated funding, have created a reputation for themselves of really being a leader of neighborhood revitalization within neighborhoods and within the city, and are really a kind of a central point for partnerships for activities such as home rehabs and vacant land reuse. So kind of the spectrum of that varies widely. And lastly, successful land banks, and this can't be understated, have a really great relationship with the communities in which they serve. Land banks really need to build trust with neighbors and neighborhoods, especially those individuals that have been most harmed by vacant properties, to better understand what the priorities are, what those end uses should be, what the policies and priorities for the land bank's operations should be. And so, as I said, land banking's new in New Jersey, but it has a robust history of being really impactful in addressing vacant and abandoned properties across the country. And so the reason why land banks are continuing to pop up, as we've seen, is because there is that proven track record of having really positive impacts within communities. The most easily tracked impacts are often those related to kind of the money, the economic impacts, the community stability impacts, the increase in property values, which is hugely important, can also lead to increase in revenues for municipalities and an increase in equity that homeowners have within their homes. But the impacts of land bank goes far beyond the kind of dollars and cents that could be put towards it. There's a number of studies on how addressing vacant and abandoned properties actually decreases gun-related crimes within communities. It can increase a sense and perception of safety within communities and improve quality of life and health for neighbors and neighborhoods. So on your screen are just a few of those, a few key highlights and impacts that I think are helpful to ground some of the important work that land banks do. So the first example comes from land banks in New York State, and the amount of investment that they've been able to receive from folks in the private sector, how much that has increased and led to assessed values being put back on the tax rolls from land banks actually intervening in properties that have long been stagnant in the public space. We've also seen studies that gun-related violence can decrease as much as 29%, which is hugely important to community safety, but it also affects public budgets. And when vacant properties kind of sit and languish, oftentimes they may be a place where police are responding to, or fire folks are responding to, but repurposing them can decrease and take some of those properties off the public rolls. And lastly, we've seen in Flint that the properties that have gone through and received land bank intervention are far less likely to be problems down the road for the municipalities and importantly for neighbors. So those properties that went through the tax foreclosure process that received land bank interventions, only 1% saw themselves through that process again, as compared to 57% of properties that didn't have any type of land bank intervention. Land banks can be and should be really strategic partners in convening community members, convening lenders, convening experts in the field, and doing this work in a comprehensive way. So when we've seen land banks be most successful, they're partnering with a lot of different groups that have niche expertise. Land banks can't be experts in everything. There's too much to do. And there's other folks within communities that already have that existing expertise, that have engagement practices in place, that have robust networks of community partners. And so it is really important for land banks to seek out and develop partnerships and relationships. But where we've seen land banks be most successful is when they're also taking that leadership role within communities to lead revitalization efforts. Tarek, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Oh, thanks. So just to continue some of the innovative work that we've seen nationally in the field, Cuyahoga Land Bank in Ohio is considered one of the most, impressive, outstanding land banks in the country. Largely it was because, as Liz mentioned, Ohio does have the only state enabling legislation that contemplates and includes dedicated funding every year. Right. So with Cuyahoga, if it's receiving $6, $7, $8 million a year, it could spend all of its expertise and capacity on innovation rather than chasing the funds. So we do see a lot of innovation. Now, if we look at some of their housing programs, they realized, with an incredibly large inventory in the thousands, they said, well, who might need housing in the community? Rather than constantly just going to the MLS and listing them, let's work with nonprofit agencies and community groups that are serving neighbors and residents that need housing. So they first started a pilot with the Refugee Services Collaboration that worked with refugees. It worked so well, they contributed 50-50, they split the cost of rehab, and then they sold the property for $1 to the agency. They were able to house their clients. And for those who support Housing First approach to dealing with folks' array of challenges, this worked really successfully. And they realized, let's just go down the list of all of those who are serving and meeting the needs in our communities: women in crisis, domestic violence victims, those who are returning from a prison, those veterans. They even started a program trying to retain college and graduate students through this work. So just a whole wheel of innovative housing programs where that can only be done if you think about connecting with partners in the community. We've also had the great pleasure to work with our national counterpart, Grounded Solutions Network, which manages a network of all of the community land trusts across the country. And to think about how can we kind of incentivize and explore land banks working more intentionally with community land trusts. That we often think of them as working in completely different markets, where the community land trust is just in the hot market, land banks are in the weakest housing market. There are many communities that have mixed market neighborhoods. And so we've cultivated and incubated a number of these partnerships, as you can see here across the country. And then we've captured a lot of that work. It was a 5-year initiative in a publication, but it just goes to show, and while we supported this, it was always the folks on the ground that was doing the incredible work. And to read more about how land banks are playing a central role in meeting housing needs across the entire income spectrum, you can find that on our website. But great models of partnerships. And then what was wonderful was, as we were working with the Newark Land Bank, to find out that, while it's just the first land bank in New Jersey, it's also the first land bank in the country that has figured out how to partner with the housing authority to bring to use vouchers towards homeownership. It is allowed, it is underutilized across the country, and to see a land bank playing a central role in that is just incredibly inspiring, something that we intend to lift up to the national field, but we'd also love to see scale up in Newark and across New Jersey. Oh, yes, more information on October 3rd. The next webinar, it will feature leadership from Newark Land Bank. We wanted to now move closer to statewide practice and to really have you all kind of listen to what were some of the successes, but real challenges and ongoing challenges that Newark is facing in its first few years of operations. And then we can have some broader conversations about what that might mean across New Jersey. So we did want to finish this conversation, though, as we talked about the national impacts and kind of a land banking 101 to bring it back to the New Jersey Land Bank law. What is unique about it, what might present some challenges to the local economic and housing conditions in communities across New Jersey that we learned from so many of the partners on this call. So one, let's just first set the stage. Who can actually establish land banks in New Jersey? So the law allows that municipalities can establish a land bank via an ordinance, and you can appoint an existing entity, right? That could be a municipal redevelopment agency. It could be a county improvement entity. It could be an existing nonprofit organization. It's often that in some state laws, like in Ohio, because tax foreclosure only happens at the county, the state land bank law only allows counties to create land banks, right? In New Jersey, any municipality can, and municipalities can even join together, or they can, multiple municipalities can appoint one, the same nonprofit. So a lot of opportunity there. Now, when it comes to the powers, as Liz referenced earlier, where some land bank acts at the state level really explicitly spell out what the powers of a land bank are, the New Jersey bill grants a lot of that discretion to the municipality creating the land bank. And it's within that land bank agreement that you kind of dictate what powers that are being granted to the land bank. So how are properties acquired? It should spell that out. How are properties disposed? Does the council need to approve every disposition, or can the land bank operate independently? So are properties held tax exempt, right? That is not a blanket power granted unilaterally. It needs to be spelled out in the agreement. So where in some states we can actually look at one municipality that goes through, their first ordinance, and then we can just replicate that. There's going to be a lot of variation across New Jersey, and that can actually be really good. It can meet the political conditions that exist in your community. If there's maybe a cautious temperature, you could start out and then reform it. It could also be great to tailor to the local needs in your community. So a land bank, as I mentioned, can act on behalf of more than one municipality at the same time. This is something we see all over the country, right? Is, you have your mid-sized, larger sized cities that, even though they might be resource constrained, they still have the capacity to create a land bank and to support that effort. Many very small villages, rural communities, obviously have more challenges. And so you start to see regional land banks, or you see collaboration. The New Jersey law allows that, if we can go back, in a sense where multiple municipalities could maybe appoint or grant their land bank powers to the same regional or county entity, and then it could serve those areas. They needn't be contiguous. They need to be immediately adjacent to each other. So again, it does allow for a variation how land banks can kind of roll out here in New Jersey. You also have, New Jersey has a lot of tools to address vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties, whether that's through code enforcement. You have your spotlight, eminent domain, the Vacant Property Receivership Act, or the Abandoned Properties Rehabilitation Act, and the powers then that are conferred under that. A lot of those can be basically granted to the land bank. Right. So you're not just creating this one entity that is dealing with the tax foreclosed properties, but you could really be creating this kind of regional expertise or hub of expertise to address vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties in a community. So something a little different than in other states that we've seen. And we're still learning ourselves. All of these tools, Matt and Stacy have been incredibly helpful to have at the network to help us understand that. We have some lawyers on our team that are further diving deeper into this, but just want to admit, with a lot of humility, is that because there is so much variation, there's a lot more research that is on our plate to move through. And then if we could jump to the next thing, but we kind of knew that there would be some barriers to implementing land banks in New Jersey that we have seen in other communities before we came in, and then the listening tour affirmed some of those and added a couple others. So the first one, I think some of you have been probably very astute listeners, and you were like, wait a second, if all the properties come through the tax foreclosure process, we sell tax liens, that's going to be a problem. It is a problem. Any community that is selling tax liens, in other words, every year the municipality is offering the debt for sale to any private investor or bidder, they're basically removing that property from the foreclosure pipeline, right? Which could then fall into the land bank's portfolio. And that might be a little technical, and we can get into that maybe in the half-hour conversation. But in our conversation with folks, we've heard that a lot of the nonprofits were either going to bid on tax liens and have done that in past years, or 10 years ago, 15 years ago, so many of these tax liens, nobody would bid on, right? Because the market was much weaker. There was a lot more vacancy, distress. And so that was when the municipality, after a year, could then foreclose on that lien and then take ownership and maybe pass it through a land bank or a nonprofit. Well, now we get to the second major barrier. Your housing markets are so hot, particularly all of those communities around New York City, right? And we've heard this from actual, we've quantified this with so many of the local partners into Newark. Every tax sale that's going up for bid is being bought, right? So in Newark, for example, 5 years ago, they would offer their tax lien sales like 1,500, maybe 500 would receive bids. 1,000 of them might end up owned by Newark, right? Now, just this last year, they said that 24, 20 of them were not bid on, right? So just that pipeline of potential property for a land bank, at least its primary pipeline, has diminished considerably, right? So even those we heard from nonprofits, yeah, we used to bid at the tax liens. Well, now we're being outbid many times by outside investors. And we used to get them from the city if nobody bid, but now everything's being bid on. So that's drying up. So this is a real challenge, and we want to be very open about that, because as we've seen across the country, kind of a catchphrase is that as the housing market heats up, the utility of a land bank diminishes, right? Because if the property has market potential and it has value, somebody's going to pick it up. It is where we see, an increase in vacancy, an increase in historic disinvestment from unjust and racist policies over decades, where we start to see an accumulation in very weak housing markets. Well, that's where a land bank now can play a role in turning that trend around. The third barrier, there are 4. This is still a new thing. As Liz said, right as there was a lot of energy in the incredible work that the network did with its allies over years, this bill was passed in 2019. Of course, every municipality turned all their attention to more urgent needs in the community following COVID. So nobody has really had even the interest or capacity. And then when every community has been basically flush with ARPA funding and other dollars, the focus has been on how do we program these dollars. So this really is a good time to now restart those conversations, but there is going to need to be a lot of education and learning, particularly with the decision makers. As I've noticed, almost everyone here who introduced themselves are from, it seems like, the nonprofit sector. I saw a banking representative and maybe a housing authority representative. I didn't see any government officials here. So that is something that we're going to have to continue to do throughout this engagement partnership with the network. Last thing. Lack of dedicated funding, right? This is a problem that land banks all across the country face, but the amount of creativity and innovation is very impressive. I would also say that dollars follow success. Once land banks start to be seen and creating accomplishments as a critical tool in equitable development, we have seen land banks become much more savvy and successful in pulling in philanthropic dollars, state grants, federal grants, private funding, even, to carry out and continue the work. Next slide, please. So is this back to you, Liz?
Yeah, I can take it. So thanks, Tarek.
Right, and then we'll be available for questions.
Yeah. And so we want to use the last 15 minutes to do a question and answer, and then of course stick around for folks that want to have that conversation. So this is a good time to put your questions in the chat. But just wanted to give a preview of what we have coming up as part of this 2-webinar series. So next time that we meet will be October 3rd. And as Tarek mentioned, we'll have leadership from the Newark Land Bank be a part of that conversation to share some of the really innovative programming that they've had, along with describing some of the successes and the challenges that they've had to date, as an opportunity to learn from Newark's example as other communities are starting to think about implementing land banks within their own communities. We'll also talk about how communities can evaluate if a land bank is a right fit. So Tarek described some of the opportunities and also some of the challenges. So we'll get a little bit more into like what are those questions you should be asking locally to determine whether or not a land bank could be helpful. And as I mentioned at the start of this conversation, is that the Center for Community Progress and the network will be releasing a scholarship opportunity for communities that are interested in some technical assistance support from our teams to explore whether or not a land bank could be a useful tool. And so our next conversation will be talking a little bit more about that application process, be sharing more about who's eligible, kind of what would be required as part of not just the application process of what the engagement would look like, and so on. And that's all that we have in terms of a presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing and see if there's anything in the chat.
Nothing in the chat. And if folks don't have any immediate question, I'd love to just, Liz and I were curious, like, is anyone on this call, have you been in conversations with local folks about potentially exploring a land bank? What has that kind of landscape been in your community?
Hi, everyone. My name is Nia Blade. I'm from Clinton Hill Community Action in Newark. Although Newark had its own land bank, and I was just in a meeting talking to some of the officials there, I think that for our target community, it would be something that's advantageous. This is my first entree into learning what land banking is and what it can do. So I'm very enthused. Me and one of my coworkers are here. We're very, very, very interested because we as an organization are trying to satisfy the affordable housing mission that we have. And I think the land bank is like perfect for that. It's almost like tailor-made. So we're really interested, and we look forward to any and all information that you guys have. Oh, also, not off the topic, but are we going to get a copy of the slide deck for this? Because it was amazing, and that
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll share that.
So fast.
And we'll also work with the network. They already have some great resources on their website for land banking, but we'll continue to build that out as this partnership unfolds, and really trying to tailor some resources that are informed by your all questions and interests. We said we'd get to some questions, so I want and asked to raise hands. So I see Sulina had raised her hand, so I am. Oh, did I just mute you twice?
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Hey.
With the City of Camden Redevelopment Agency, and for about 10 years or so, we had some experience with the land bank. Ours has been specific to certain census tracts, and it was born from the NSP2 program. And as part of that, and the virtue of us being a redevelopment agency, we were able to establish and work in partnership with the city and other stakeholders to conserve and preserve properties within that land bank. But recently, there have been some discussions about perhaps expanding it to a citywide look. So that's our experience here in Camden. One of my colleagues, Candace Walker, is on the line, and she may have more to add to that.
Thank you for that. And I think it raises a great point that a lot of places may be kind of informally land banking properties. either at the city level or at a redevelopment level, and doing a similar kind of strategic look at addressing vacant properties within a targeted neighborhood or within a targeted region. And so those land banking programs have been really successful in many communities across the country. What we're talking about is a little bit different, where it's a kind of this separate established entity with the unique powers that are provided through that land banking agreement. And so if the city of Camden is interested in kind of exploring what that could look like at the municipal level with those additional tools and powers, it might be a great opportunity to continue conversations with you all on that in the future. So thank you. Is it Allie? We can come to you next with your hand raised.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me? Great, thanks. This presentation was great. So it got me thinking about, given how that there is a cost associated with running these, and it's hard to recapture, you really need grants. Are there any models that that take a regional approach or even potentially a statewide approach to this, you know, partnering with municipalities or community-based organizations?
I can start, Tarek, and then you can. There are a number of examples of regional land banks that have kind of an opt-in model, either at the municipal level or at the county level, for states that allow counties to establish land banks or opt into land banks. Prior to joining Community Progress, I actually helped to start a multi-municipal land bank outside of the city of Pittsburgh that served the fairly dense but suburban communities that were not a part of the city, that didn't have the opportunity or the capacity to form a land bank on their own, but worked with a council of governments to establish a multi-municipal land bank entity. And so that entity can serve municipalities within the counties that are interested, and it's purely opt-in. And as part of that opt-in, there are some conditions where the municipality does have to pay essentially a membership fee, which is based on a formula that the land bank had created, along with agreeing to do some of the tax recapture that's allowed in Pennsylvania law and is also allowed in New Jersey law. There's another example in kind of the upstate region of New York, the Greater Mohawk Valley Land Bank, that provides land banking services to urban and rural communities for those places that decide to opt in. So it is an opportunity for communities that might not have the capacity or the resources to fund a land bank on their own.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the one thing I would just add, because Liz is a little humble, I mean, what was done in the Tricog Land Bank is incredible. It's the only land bank that got that many municipalities and school districts to voluntarily contribute tax revenue. And the reason why is because they spent a lot of time educating about what are the current costs of vacant properties. And we've done this in other communities. When you look at what a municipality is currently spending on sending code officers, police officers, fire officers, you know, fire damage, there's many times drug overdoses, unfortunately, tragically, the loss of tax revenue. And when we've quantified those costs, suddenly you realize 1 million, 2 million a year we're spending on the status quo, and it's just getting worse. And so that can help change the conversation and say, let's shift this, be proactive. Let's give the land bank the resources it's needed to take and steward these properties, to work with the partners, and then to leverage those dollars for federal, state grants, philanthropic support, others. But there really is, I mean, again, if these properties had value, the market would pull them in. So there's always going to need to be some infusion, right? Public subsidy or otherwise. Particularly the more you want equitable outcomes. And I know in New Jersey, as your housing market's heating up and you still want to serve the 50%, 60% AMI, the amount of public subsidy that's going to be needed in turning around these vacant abandoned properties is even greater, right? There's just no way around that. So one, ensuring folks understand the cost of the status quo, which is harmful, and then the value of equitable outcomes in and of themselves.
Matt, do you want to jump in? Oop, you're muted.
And Tarek didn't even mute me. I muted myself. I did just want to jump in and just mention that, during the pre-webinar interviews with many of you, that was a real reality and feedback that we received as far as municipality. Newark can do it all. Jersey City could do it with land bank. Patterson has the capacity to do land bank. So the major cities, but it's the smaller municipalities that would need to work together. That would provide them the capacity to actually put together a kind of a comprehensive land banking approach. So in New Jersey, we have that famous home rule that has the bright municipal boundaries, and it does require another level of advocacy and coordination. And I think when we look at the kind of genesis of the land bank law, how it was, how it came to pass, it was our legislative leaders had the breadth of kind of perspective when it came to their districts. Mila J.C. understood that her district included the westward of Newark, but also Maplewood, and other contiguous communities. So that's going to be part of moving forward, as well as making sure that we can get municipalities to work together. So any feedback that members have, that network members have, or that you or your colleagues have, or your local governments, it would be really valuable to know that. And just a side note, we'll be Chelsea and I will be bringing this up at our next A-team meetings as well. So that conversation will continue.
Thanks, Matt. And feel free to continue to raise your hand, but I'm going to go to some of the questions that were presented in the chat. So there's a question about whether land bank can be used for homeless use. And certainly that goes back to the conversation around partnerships and who the land bank is going to prioritize in terms of end users and ownership for those properties. So we've had more land banks come to us in recent years, trying to think about how they can serve as that conduit for organizations or entities that are really serving homeless populations, and what kind of programming could look like around that. And Tarek, you might need to add some of the details here, but the Chatham Land Bank in Savannah, Georgia has some of that programming in place and is doing some pilots with some of their properties to serve homeless populations.
Yeah, and that's something we're hoping to just kind of cultivate and incubate more of around the country through the National Land Bank Network. Just really having the land banks in conversation with their continuum of care, right? Their local or regional continuum of care. How might they be able to provide that support, et cetera. It also can open up new opportunities of funding for the land bank, and that capital dollars are really tough to come by, but I know that some states are making some significant investment into permanent supportive housing, and that could be a way where land bank really accomplishes a major community need and a goal. I think there was another question about raising revenues. And I think one thing I would just say is that, with Ohio having their provision, some communities have explored like mortgage recording tax. That is usually done at the county. Oftentimes, sometimes states require that, there needs to be state approval. So it's different. I'm not sure. But I'll tell you that it's just harder and harder to get local leaders at any level to support a tax increase. So it's just still trying to figure that one out. But there are a number of different funding mechanisms that folks have thought about to try to increase their revenue capacity. I also saw the question about, is it wise to wait? I think it's kind of like a climate action plan, right? You don't wait to the storm. You have that plan. You hope you never have to utilize it, but then at least the knowledge is there. Your plan is there. I would say the same thing. There are some communities like Chattanooga, Tennessee. It's so hot right now, but they're still going to create a land bank, or they have one on paper. And now they've increased their knowledge and understanding about what it can do. And they've written it into their long-term affordable housing plan, such that if the market does collapse, right, which we don't want to see because the trauma that causes, but if it does collapse, then at least they have the tool ready to go. So my answer, Gail, would be is continue the conversation, raise the knowledge, and see if folks can see that as a potential tool, and if the need is ever there in the future.
And related to funding of the land bank, so not specific revenue from municipalities, but the philanthropic community has been very supportive of land banks kind of at various stages we've seen across the country. Typically kind of at the initial stage, wanting to support and provide seed funding to a land bank to help get it off the ground, to provide general operating fund to really help the land bank flesh out the agreement or the policies and procedures, establish their board of directors and staff and all of that. And most philanthropy doesn't love general operating funding, but they would support some type of programming that might align with some of their core missions. So greening programs of vacant lots and community gardens that maybe could also address safety, or new homeownership programs where that, as Tarek mentioned, that subsidy is critical to really reach the folks in the AMI level that land banks might want to prioritize. And so getting some philanthropic support from that, we've seen land banks be very successful in that space across the country. There is another question related to how is a land bank different than the private real estate, and the capacity to implement it. And so the core difference is the land bank's really targeting those vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties that can be potentially incredibly underwater, that are in unsafe condition, that folks just generally don't want. And the private market has discarded. And importantly, the land bank their selling decisions are driven by community needs and not by the highest bid. Now, sometimes it is the highest bid that a land bank will take, but really their mission and their decision making is aligned with what the community needs, and less about what's going to get the land bank the top dollar in revenue moving forward. And so they really are a steward of kind of public land, a community's biggest asset, as Tarek always says, second biggest asset next to its people, and thinking through how that land is going to be repurposed. So I want to just pause and say we're at the hour mark, but as I mentioned, we're still here in conversation. But if folks want to jump off, you're not going to offend us because we did just ask for an hour of your time, but we'll continue to go through some of the questions that are popping up in the chat, and certainly encourage folks to continue to raise their hand. All right. So there is a question about, can a land bank be too big? Or have too many municipalities, too many properties, what's optimal, etc. And the land bank really needs to operate at a scale and at an inventory level that it has the capacity and the funding to do so. So that's not a perfect answer to the question, but if a land bank has 2,000 properties and is getting $0 from local government or any partners, and doesn't have the capacity to address the existing problems at those properties, it's not funded, it doesn't have the capacity and staff to do that work, the last thing we want is a land bank to be another negligent property owner in the community and continue to cause harm. And so a land bank's operations really needs to be scaled to the funding and the capacity that is available, or vice versa. The funding and capacity really needs to meet the land bank at the scale it's being expected to operate at.
And just to wow some folks, I mean, the Detroit Land Bank has 80,000 properties. That's obviously the outlier. Genesee County Land Bank, where Flint is, the land bank owns half of all the residential vacant lots in the city, right? I mean, so we're talking serious, significant systemic vacancy. But then it runs, as Liz says, the gamut. It can be, they're holding 100 properties. They're only doing maybe 5 a year because that's what their funding allows, or, they're slowly managing 500, 600, 700. I would also say I hope I wasn't too much of a Debbie Downer when we talked about the barriers, right? It's we're creative folks, and we work with a lot of creative folks in the national field. And so while there are some communities where we would say, you know what, it's not worth creating a land bank. that's not the problem you're trying to solve. When we really engage them in some closer conversations, maybe a much more robust code enforcement program, proactive, strategic would be helpful here. But I would also say that we're going to think through some creative iterations, right? You have a tax lien sale process. We had conversations with folks in Tucson, Arizona. They said, we hate this process, but the state law is inflexible and we can't change the state law. So maybe to create an entity that would buy all of the tax liens and work more directly with the homeowners to keep them in their property, to charge less interest rates. And then for those that truly fall through and need foreclosure, now that entity has control, right? The law allows Newark land banks to purchase tax liens and bid on them. So maybe there's something, that can be done. Other communities where nonprofits do not have tax exempt status, the land bank has and does have tax exempt status. They basically become a holder of land while the nonprofits work out their financing for maybe catalytic or large scale development. And as folks know on this, that is huge benefit. And then they withdraw their land when they're ready to build. So it's really about having careful conversations. What are your local conditions? What are your local opportunities? If there are folks here that wanted to maybe further explore locally, might want to have conversation with your local officials. What has the kind of trends been with your tax lien sale? Has there been a lot more, a lot less? How many are actually receiving no bids? How many are defaulting to the municipality? And are they foreclosing, right? Maybe just to get a sense of what that looks like in your community, and then come back and join us in October for the second land bank, and then maybe be ready to submit an application for the scholarship that we'd be working with you most of next year. Didn't want to cut the conversation there. I just wanted to make sure I didn't sound too defeatist in my presentation.
You still see a lot of potential for land banking in the state of New Jersey, is what Tarek's saying. So next question is, while a land bank could be a number of entities that we described, a county improvement, nonprofit, municipal redevelopment agency, does it ideally work collaboratively with all, even though it's kind of designated as one? And should it work collaboratively alongside the municipality? And that's essential for a land bank to be successful, especially in that relationship with the municipality, because the municipality is the entity that creates and designates who's going to serve as the land bank on behalf of the municipality, and also is, one of two parties to that land bank agreement and has the authority to pass along those powers to the land bank. Even with that, the land bank's going to need to work alongside the municipality and understandings. What are the municipality's development goals? What are their housing goals? What are targeted neighborhood plans that a municipality might have, or targeted end uses and ideals that the city is working on through their planning department or economic development department or other departments within the community? We talked kind of briefly here and there, but code enforcement is a hugely important tool in addressing vacant and abandoned properties, and it's often code enforcement and land banks working together to prioritize properties within a community, or just share that knowledge that code enforcement teams know so deeply about specific problem properties that may exist within a community. And so it absolutely needs to work with not just the municipality, but other partners that are working in this space. We've seen land banks be successful at kind of serving as that entity that can acquire targeted properties and then potentially transfer it to some type of larger economic development purpose that's being worked on by the county or by the city or a number of folks within this space. So another question related to the environmental due diligence on property before the property is transferred to the land bank. Tarek, do you want to take that one and talk a little bit about our upcoming work with EPA?
Yeah, so this differs, I'd say, but most of the time it's afterwards, and that the land bank is responsible for doing the due diligence. And We're also talking about, this could be just whether asbestos, if it's demolition, this could be whether there's lead hazards, right? And it's going to be a residential rehab, or if we're talking about potential brownfield and that level of contamination and risk. When it comes to brownfields, and that was another thing I wanted to mention that I forgot, is that, you know, land banks could play a more active role in brownfield remediation. And New Jersey has some great, you know, laws regarding this and programs, and also good rich history in success projects. But we actually are just starting a 4-year research project, thanks to a grant from the EPA, about what are the barriers of land banks getting involved in brownfield redevelopment? Where are land banks doing that successfully? And then what kind of educational materials can we create for the national field of practice to encourage more land banks to be involved? And it's definitely a great opportunity. There's a lot of New York, Ohio, Michigan, some land banks that are doing some incredible work with brownfield remediation. And the problem has often been, as you may know, is governments don't want to foreclose on any property that might have some environmental risk. Investors typically won't want to purchase the tax liens either, or if they do, it's purely speculative because they don't want to foreclose and then become potentially responsible party in line of title. So when it comes to brownfields, that really does create an opportunity for land banks to play a role. I think it was the Federal Build Act in 2018 really did clarify liability risks for both governments and land banks when it comes to brownfields. And they did say that whenever those properties are acquired involuntarily through a tax foreclosure process, then there is no liability. So we hope to really jumpstart that movement. We're working with actually the New Jersey Institute of Technology as our partner. They have some great folks there that are experts in this field. And so we hope to see that maybe expand alongside this work in New Jersey and across the country.
I just wanted to make a comment on a question that Mike had related to the municipal costs and the reports that Tarek put in the chat. In addition to looking at the aggregate costs, because those numbers can be incredibly powerful if you can say, you know, $100 million of lost property tax assessments, and the potential for revenue that could come from it. What we've also seen when I was working with the Tri-Cog Land Bank is picking a handful of those really known problematic properties that might have some historic tie to the community or some emotional tie. Maybe it is an elected official gets a lot of complaints from constituents about a certain property. And really just, if you can't do the aggregate cost, because it could require some amount of time and research, but taking those known properties and potentially working with municipal partners to understand the cost. Like how much tax delinquency is on that particular property? How much has the city put into abating it? Are they cutting the grass? Have they done any type of boarding or maybe some other remediation on the property? And thinking through like police and fire call that could potentially come to there, and laying out the cost for those individual properties, and then providing that alternative of what could happen if a land bank were to intervene. What could the forecasted revenue be for the municipality or the county or the school district? What could that end use be that would align with some of the priorities that existing political leaders might have related to homeownership or building generational wealth? And being able to use some of those discrete examples to talk about the benefits of a land bank. And we have some of those in a number of our reports on our website as well, of how communities have done that with just a handful of properties. So I think we answered all the questions in the chat. If we haven't, we'll give you 30 seconds to let us know or put it in.
But I think everyone here, if you've stayed to 212, you are officially part of the inaugural New Jersey Land Bank Nerd Group. And so wear that badge and honor with distinction. Thank you. We'll be sending the certificate in the mail.
Great. Yes. We got one.
Proud members here.
Yes.
And keep in mind too that we'll, Liz and Tarek and we will continue to reach out, if questions aren't coming to the forefront today, as you kind of distill all this information, definitely in the next few weeks, maybe continuing to solicit feedback.
Sorry for the pause. I was reading the comments in the chat. But thank you for that, Matt. And we will be back October 3rd. By registering for this event, you should have received the calendar invite for both. So hopefully it's already on your calendar. You can reach out to us in between those conversations, or if you have a question that pops up, feel free to engage us during that next session. But we look forward to seeing you all then, and just appreciate you spending an hour and 13 minutes with us. Thank you. Bye all.
Thank you all so much.